was ambassador to the U.S. General Carlos Romulo stated, "Never forget, Americans, that yours is a spiritual country. Yes, I know you're a practical people. Like others, I've marveled at your factories, your skyscrapers, and your arsenals. But underlying everything else is the fact that America began as a God-loving, God-fearing, and God-worshiping people."
This has been an American Minute with Bill Federer. For a free transcript, call American Minute at 1-888-USA-WORD.
VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And thank you for joining us today. October 24th is UN Day. The United Nations officially came into being October 24th, 1945. The UN Charter was ratified by a majority of its signatories, including the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. On today's program, we're going to take a look at the United Nations, its origin, its growth, its impact, and, of course, its lust for control. We're also going to be taking a look as to how this coming election will Are we going to be a nation that surrenders its sovereignty to the UN dictates, or will we be a nation putting up a wall of resistance against the United Nations? Joining us today, we welcome back Alex Newman. He is an award-winning international freelance journalist. He's an author, a researcher, educator, and consultant, senior editor for The New American, and co-author of Crimes of the Educators, author of Deep State, The Invisible Government Behind the Scenes, and also Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. Alex is founder of Liberty Sentinel. And Alex, nice to have you back today.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Jim.
So, Alex, you and I have conducted many a program exposing a number of the UN conventions and summits and events and meetings and policies, but today I'd like you to do a deep dive into the UN. On their site, they indicate that the United Nations is working together for global solutions to global problems. And it sounds like a very noble cause, but if you would take us, let's first look back, and we'll bring it up to the present and the future. But look back, and going back to October 24th, 1945 to its beginning, but even before that, we know its predecessor, the League of Nations, and I understand even some organizations that go back into the 1800s. But take us back. What do we know about its origin?
Well, from the very beginning, the UN was set up for nefarious purposes, and that kind of flies in the face of what people have been taught all their lives, because we were told that the UN was just there to keep peace, and it was the highest aspirations of mankind. And, of course, we as Christians, we know blessed are the peacemakers. And so the enemy knows that, too, and manipulates us using those things. But if you go back to the founding of the UN, what you'll find is that on both sides of the table, it was dominated by communists and subversives and individuals who have no business being anywhere near power, much less global power. And that's even true for the United States, right? People assume that because the U.S. government was such a critical part of putting this together, that it must have been designed with American principles and ideals in mind. And unfortunately, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, our main man there, if you will, his name was Alger Hiss. They really liked him. They made him the first. First, he was the chairman of the conference that wrote the UN Charter. He took a bunch of the attendees to a very bizarre meeting while they were in San Francisco for this, to the Bohemian Grove, a very strange secret society where they engage in rituals and practice the occult. And all this is actually thoroughly documented in a PhD paper. And after that, they made him the first Secretary General of the UN. So he was the first leader of the UN. And then we ended up prosecuting him. We found out that he was actually a Soviet agent, that he was working for Joseph Stalin. He was a spy. And so a young prosecutor named Richard Nixon prosecuted him and ended up throwing him in jail, quite properly, by the way. He should have been. And, of course, he was just one of many actual Soviet agents within the U.S. government at that time. People like Harry Dexter White in the Treasury Department, people like George Marshall in the State Department. Over and over again, you find these subversives were critical at every juncture, even on the American side, in setting up the UN. And one guy that we don't know had any Soviet sympathies per se, John Foster Dulles, although we know he was a big-time globalist. His brother was one of the early leaders of the CIA, Alan Dulles. He wrote in his book, War or Peace, actually I have the full quote in front of me probably. Let's see if I can pull it up real quick. But he wrote a book that was published in 1950 where he kind of let the cat out of the bag, what they were trying to do, and he explained pretty clearly that one world government was the goal. Let me pull it up real quick here so we can read the exact quote. People can see what he said. Let's see. Well, I'll pull it up while we talk, Jim, but he was very open about the fact that the goal is and always was to turn the UN into a one-world government, and of course that is exactly what they have been doing all these years, little by little. And as you know, I was at the Summit of the Future just a couple weeks ago,
yes,
and that was on the agenda. I mean, that was the goal. And I do have that quote here, by the way, if you don't mind me reading it.
Sure.
Jim.
Go ahead.
So it's 1850, the book War or Peace by John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, one of the key delegates to the founding of the UN. He said, the United Nations represents not a final stage in the development of world order, but only a primitive stage. Therefore, its primary task is to create the conditions which will make possible a more highly developed organization. He said, I've never seen any proposal made for collective security with teeth in it or for world government or world federation which could not be carried out either by the United Nations or under the United Nations Charter. So very, very clear that from the beginning they were planning on turning this into a one-world government, and very clear that from the beginning communists, socialists, totalitarians of every stripe were involved in creating it.
Now, FDR was just completing office, I think, about this time. Did he have his hand in this? Franklin Delano Roosevelt?
FDR at that point was really not all there. So it was really his administration that was involved. Mm-hmm. But, even FDR, if you look at what he did to the United States, he brought about one of the largest expansions of federal power that had ever been seen in American history, with the possible exception of the aftermath of the Civil War. And so you had FDR and literally Soviet agents under him working on this from the U.S. side. And then, of course, you had Joseph Stalin working on it from the Soviet side, and his Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Molotov. So a really nasty group of people that set up this organization. And it's a mystery to me why Americans wouldn't understand this history.
Yeah, so you're saying from the get-go, world government was always their goal.
Yes, and that is, again, very, very clear from their own documents. From people can get the book War or Peace by John Foster Dulles anywhere they want. It's at your local library. It'll be available on Amazon, and people can see for themselves that even the people who did this admitted that the goal, that's really one of the interesting things about this, is that 60 years ago, 70 years ago, 80 years ago, the calls for world government were much more open. I co-wrote a whole book on this called World Federalism 101, where we went back into the congressional record, and they were openly talking about world government and how it would be desirable to have a one-world government. So they've kind of swept that under the rug now because people, they found out, get alarmed when you talk about world government, but that was much more open back in those days.
Very interesting. Now, Alex, there's also the UN Security Council, and there are 5 nations that have what they call veto authority?
Yes, and they do want to make major reforms to the UN, including reform of the Security Council. Now, one of the reasons that they were able to convince Americans in the U.S. Congress that we ought to be involved here is because they said, hey, we're going to have veto power, right? They're not going to be able to do anything that we don't want them to do. Well, they have been hoping to change that around for a long time. And they actually got that enshrined in the Summit of the Future, the final outcome document, the Pact for the Future, that we need to reform the Security Council. So they have several different reforms that they envision. One thing that they want to do is put a permanent African member on there. My hypothesis is that they're going to try to probably put the African Union on as a permanent member, as if that was a legitimate government. And the other thing that they want to do, which is, of course, very, very significant, is they want to remove the veto power of the permanent members, which would stop the last emergency brake on the path of this entity to total global power.
So they really want to do away with the Security Council as far as the authority that each of those members have. It seems as if the Security Council has greater power than the UN itself.
Yes, the Security Council does have essentially incredible power. If you look at the UN Charter, that is the organization within the UN that has the power to deploy troops. So if the Security Council wakes up tomorrow and determines that there is a threat to international peace and security somewhere in the world, they have the authority, at least on paper under the UN Charter, to conscript troops from around the world, including American troops, to go serve under UN command in whatever battle the UN Security Council determines they need to fight in the interest of peace and security. And if you look at the times that these peacekeepers have been deployed in the past, that should send a shiver down all of our spines. Mm-hmm. The major ones early on in the early 1960s was Katanga. You had a brutal Soviet-backed mass-murdering gangster dictator in the Congo, Patrice Lumumba. And the province of Katanga decided they didn't want to live under this dictatorship, and so they broke free, and they declared independence. And the leader there, Moise Chombe, was a Christian. He was very pro-West. He was very pro-America. He did not want his people to live as slaves to a communist regime controlled by the Soviet Union. And so he led that battle. And the UN decided that that was a threat to international peace and security. So they deployed peacekeepers there. They started bombing hospitals. They started slaughtering civilians. They started shooting cars as cars were trying to flee from the war zone. It was a horrible, horrible stain on the UN, and it was an atrocity perpetrated against the people of Katanga who just wanted freedom.
Alex Newman is our guest today, founder of Liberty Sentinel, and also is senior editor for The New American. Alex, let's also bring in the International Court of Justice. What is this, and what is its relationship to the United Nations?
So the International Court of Justice is kind of like the UN's version of a Supreme Court, right? And they say in the Pact for the Future that all nations must submit to the decisions of the International Court of Justice. That's very problematic, first of all, because we as Americans have virtually no influence over this court. Why in the world should we submit to a court that we have no influence over, no accountability? And I think it's also important to make people aware that this court operates on very different legal principles than we are familiar with here in the United States, and the legal principles that have evolved over 2,000 years of Christian history. Things like the Magna Carta that enshrined certain rights that governments were bound to respect. Things like we have in our Bill of Rights, the presumption of innocence, the trial by jury, basic legal principles. None of that is included in these international kangaroo courts, whether it be the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court. And so the idea that the American people should be bound by the rulings of this illegitimate court is frankly insulting and ridiculous. But if you read the Pact for the Future, which the Biden administration fully supported, we are committed to respecting and bowing down to the decisions of this entity. Yeah.
Now, what did nations really know? I mean, so you read some of the documents, but did they know that this was really about, was this publicly stated? Was it known out there that the UN was looking for world control? And I ask that because it seems like there was a period of time, and then we started seeing so many of these, UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Law of the Sea Treaty, and others. I mean, that's when so many became really aware of what the UN was trying to do.
Yes, and you've seen this evolution, right? A lot of the governments that originally participated in the creation of the UN would not have been able to bring their populations along if they had known, if the people had known that the eventual objective was to dismantle sovereignty and create a one-world system. They were told that this was just about peace. But now, as you look at the evolution of the UN over the last 80 years, they have rapidly expanded into education, environment, economy, climate change, the rights of children, all these different things that were never supposed to be part of the mandate of the UN. So it's very, very troubling, and I don't think people knew when this started.
Friends, you're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America. Alex Newman is our guest today. We're talking about the United Nations, its past and present, and also its lust for control, future control as well, ultimate control. We'll be back in just 1 minute. This is Crosstalk coming your way from the VCY American Network.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, scientist with the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, has anyone found water on Mars?
Chris, it's common for evolutionists to claim that Mars used to be covered with water. And they have found some indirect evidences for water, but the polar ice caps, which are the most likely source of the water, they're composed of carbon dioxide. They've also found some geographical features that look like lakes or riverbeds or floodplains. Chris, even if they do find evidence for water on Mars, that's no problem. They're hoping that if they find water, they'll find life, and that'll prove that life is nothing special, that it happens by natural processes. But that's not true. Life is unimaginably complex. It needs a creator, and when we read about him and his creation back in Genesis, he doesn't mention Mars.
If you'd like to go back to Genesis, you can find us on the web at www.icr.org. For the Institute for Creation Research, I'm Chris O'Brien. Thanks for tuning in.
United Nations Day, October 24th. With us today, Alex Newman, and doing a deep dive into the United Nations. And we see not only its past, really from the get-go, world control was in their sights, and it's becoming much more visible as days go on. At one time, it was said under dark of night or under the covers or with muffled voice, but it's very open, Alex. It's very forthright today. There's no secret. There's no guessing. It's not something that is before it was said to be conspiracy theory, but it's brought in broad daylight today.
It is, yeah, and there was a time where a lot of this stuff was hidden. People had no idea. But today, they will shout it from the rooftops. They try and write in their own documents what they're doing, their agenda for global control. They don't beat around the bush anymore. And, for a long time, they would ridicule people or call them conspiracy theorists if they pointed out that the UN was ultimately hoping to usurp more and more authority until it became kind of a one-world government. Today, that is almost universally understood among the people who are leading this effort. And now they mock people for not wanting it. Oh, you're just such a kook. Why wouldn't you want the UN to have these powers? Do you want people to be hungry? Do you love poverty? Why wouldn't you want the UN to help solve these alleged world problems? And so now they frame it as you're a bad person for not supporting these ideas, rather than being a bad person for arguing that this is what the UN is trying to do.
Well, and let's look at what the UN is trying to do. And there are some foundational documents where we've discussed several times Agenda 2030, and it had a predecessor of Agenda 21. So introduce these goals or documents here to us, because these are so foundational to where the UN is heading at this time.
Yes. So Agenda 21 is really the agenda for the 21st century. So think of it like the 100-year plan. The Soviets used to have those plans, 10-year plan, 5-year plan, 100-year plan. So the UN also has those. And so the Agenda 21, this was approved in 1992 at the Earth Summit, where they came up with a lot of very important ideas and documents. And the idea was to plan for the 21st century, for what we wanted the world to look like, how we wanted everything to go. And if you read Agenda 21, it's hundreds of pages long, but it is available on the UN's website. Every government in the world signed on to it. The U.S. government, by George H.W. New World Order Bush, signed up with full support, by the way, of Democrats in Congress. Nancy Pelosi gave a very long-winded speech on the floor of the House talking about why Agenda 21 was so important and how we needed to align our government with the principles of Agenda 21, and it needed to be infused into everything. But it deals with every aspect of life, Jim. Chapter 36 deals with education, has a very clear vision of education. It has to give children, the document says, the right attitudes, values, behaviors, and beliefs that are consistent with the UN's ideas for sustainable development. And this is in plain English. Right? It deals with land use. It deals with fishing. It deals with law. It deals with business. It deals with family. It deals with everything you can think of. And so that's the kind of overarching plan. And then in the process of bringing about this 100-year plan, they've got kind of bite-sized chunks, if you will. And so from 2000 to 2015, they had the Millennium Development Goals. Well, those goals expired in 2015, and of course, very much like the current goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, they had all these lofty aspirations. We're going to eliminate poverty, we're going to eliminate racism, we're going to eliminate hunger. None of those things, of course, were ever accomplished. The UN policies only tend to make those things worse. And so now we've got the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda, which is the next 15-year plan from 2015 to 2030. And when this was approved back in 2015, the head of the UN General Assembly at that time said that this was the master plan for humanity, was the term that he and many other leaders of the UN were using to describe this thing. So obviously we're talking about a very, very significant document. And if you read it, if you read the 17 different goals, what you'll see is, again, they have specific objectives for every area of our life and our government, from the environment to the economy to the education of our children. Everybody is going to be subjected to this. As they say over and over again in the document, no one will be left behind. Everyone will participate. We're going to transform the world. These are all quotes from the text of this. And again, this is not something that Americans have ever been consulted about. This is not something that's compatible with our constitutional system of limited government, but it is what the UN is using as, in their words, the master plan to guide humanity.
Wow. And so we have this master plan, and so these are the goals that are out there and they're working toward. And so when we see these various summits come around, when we have the various accords like the Paris Accord and other agreements that are coming forth, when we have the Summit of the Future, which just took place a month ago, these are all tools to get us to that end. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. And these are all international agreements that brick by brick are being used to build the House of World Order. And the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Gardner, former Assistant Secretary of State, he wrote in 1974 in the magazine of the Council on Foreign Relations, it's called Foreign Affairs, how they were going to build the New World Order. And he said, the old-fashioned frontal assault on sovereignty doesn't work anymore. You can't just march an army into some place and say, hey, now you're going to obey the world order. He said the approach that they're going to use is the erosion of sovereignty, the gradual erosion of sovereignty. He said we're going to erode it piece by piece until we can eventually get the world order. And so as you look at all these different international agreements, and there's a dizzying array of these. Every year the UN comes up with tons of new international agreements. Each one chips away a little bit at a particular area of our sovereignty, our ability to govern ourselves. So they'll pass an education agreement over there, committing every government to implement these things in the schools. They'll pass a sustainability agreement here on how land has to be treated that'll be implemented by all the governments. And before you know it, the UN and its international agreements govern every area of your life, and your government is just basically implementing UN agreements.
Right.
And that's the approach they're using.
And so, therefore, we eventually get to the completion of the master plan for humanity.
That's right.
Alex, let me introduce a couple other organizations, entities, and I'd like you to, for instance, World Economic Forum. What is the connection between the World Economic Forum and the United Nations?
So they're essentially partners, and that's not my term, that's their term. They have been working together for decades, but more recently, to go back to the 2030 agenda momentarily, they're pursuing what Peter Drucker, one of their kind of luminaries, described as a three-legged stool approach to bringing about these major global changes. And the three-legged stool he envisioned had the first leg of the stool being the public sector, the governments of the world. And so in 2015 at the UN General Assembly, every national government in the world committed to the 2030 Agenda Sustainable Development Goals. Well, then the World Economic Forum signed a strategic partnership, and the UN put out a press release about this, and the World Economic Forum put out a press release about this, saying that the World Economic Forum was now a strategic partner of the UN in bringing the business community into the 2030 agenda, into implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. That's what they described it as, a strategic partnership. So there's the second leg of the stool. That's the business leg. And the way that they do this, I mean, obviously most of the Fortune 500 are intimately intertwined with the World Economic Forum, but you also have less obvious mechanisms of control. And I'll give you one example that I think some people listening will be familiar with. Larry Fink. He's on the board of trustees for the World Economic Forum. He's also on the board of directors for the Council on Foreign Relations. And he's, of course, the head of BlackRock, the largest asset manager, the largest financial institution in the world. They've got at least $10 or $20 trillion under management, not including all the money that is managed based on their supercomputer, the Aladdin program. So huge, huge influence over the economy of the world. They're actually the largest stakeholder in most of the companies among the Fortune 500. So that gives you and it's oftentimes in competitors. They'll be the biggest shareholder in Coke. They'll be the biggest shareholder in Pepsi. And so through this influence, they're basically using our money. They're voting our shares to get these companies to do what they want. And so take the DEI thing, for example, or the climate thing, for example. They will go to these boards of directors and say, look, we own a 10% share in your company, and we expect you to implement diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if you don't, we're going to be voting to remove you as a director. We're going to be voting to reduce your pay. We're going to punish you. And so Larry Fink goes around the world and he tells people, we're forcing behavior change, right? So they're using our money against us. And that's just one of the many ways that the World Economic Forum is bringing businesses, not just in America, but around the world, on board. And then, of course, the last leg of the stool is the religious sector that we can talk about later. But that's kind of the relationship there. The World Economic Forum is building the infrastructure on the economic side for bringing this about. They also, by the way, played a critical role in reforming the Communist Chinese economy so that Communist China could today become a major global superpower that threatens liberty around the world.
So I'm going to bring another organization in that has certainly been striking at our national sovereignty as well, and that's the World Health Organization. So you talked about the partnership between the WEF and the UN. What about the WHO and the United Nations? What was that connection?
So the WHO is an agency of the United Nations. It's what they call a specialized agency. So the UN has 15 specialized agencies. And think of them as like cabinet-level departments, right? In the United States, we have a Department of Health and Human Services. Well, the UN has a World Health Organization. In the U.S., we have a Environmental Protection Agency. They have a UN Environment Program. In the U.S., we have a Patent Office. They have a World Intellectual Property Organization. We have a Department of Defense. They have a Department of Peacekeeping, which is just an Orwellian way of saying Department of War making. And so on every one of the elements of governance that we associate with a typical state, we now have a parallel institution at the international level. And so that's what the World Health Organization is for the UN. It's basically the global health ministry or the global Department of Health. And at this point, they're not even shy about kind of bragging about what they're doing, right? And we saw it so clearly during COVID. Almost every government in the world was doing the same things that had never been done in the history of humanity. Well, where were they getting their instructions? It's not hard to figure it out. They were getting them from Geneva, the headquarters of the World Health Organization.
Alex Newman is our guest here today on Crosstalk, doing a deep dive into the UN. And Alex, just a little bit ago, you talked about the religious sector as well. How does religion factor into all of this?
So Peter Drucker, to go back to the three-legged stool model, he outlined this approach where any lasting major global change would have to have each of these three legs to stand. So the public sector, it's all the governments of the world, right, through the UN, the United Nations, which is really United Governments. Then you have the economic sector, the private sector, the businesses, and that's where the World Economic Forum comes in. And then you have the religious sector. And so the UN actually has an organization. It's a cutout that the UN has funded, so is the State Department. It's called Religions for Peace. Now, the lady who runs it, Dr. Azza Karam, I ran into her in Egypt just a couple of years ago. Very interesting lady. She, before taking the helm of Religions for Peace, she was at the UN Population Fund, which is the UN agency in charge of reducing the population of people on the planet. They didn't like God's command that we be fruitful and multiply. They have better ideas, apparently. And so she moved from the Population Fund over to Religions for Peace. And I've got her on camera saying Religions for Peace is the United Nations of religions. And she says all religions are part of this thing. I actually called up my pastor. I said, Pastor, are we a member of Religions for Peace? Well, no, right? I haven't even heard of it. So not all religions, right? And you can be pretty much any religion you want as long as you don't say Jesus Christ is the way. Mm-hmm. But to go back to the role of religion here, Religions for Peace brought all the religious leaders of the world together in Germany in 2019. Strong support from the Vatican, strong support from a lot of allegedly evangelical Protestant churches, including the Church of England, a lot of the Orthodox churches, all the other religions, and they agreed we commit sustainable development as set forth in the 2030 agenda.
We're going to pick up where we left off with this, as well as looking at the future of the UN and the impact, certainly as to our nation's response to the United Nations through this upcoming election. Back in a minute. You're listening to Crosstalk.
You're listening to Crosstalk.
You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're listening to Crosstalk. You're liste
Entertainment has become the draw to build churches and youth groups. Meanwhile, sound biblical teaching has fallen off the cliff. To many, it's all about numbers and little about the Bible. Play the Flute, a powerful DVD, addresses this issue head on. Play the Flute tells the story of one youth leader who would not give up, who would not surrender to the apathy taking over his new youth group.
The Lord Jesus is looking for followers who realize that they are sinners and need a Savior. These are His terms, and I can't change them.
From Rich Cristiano comes Play the Flute, a powerful story on DVD available from VCY America for a donation of $18 or more. Call 1-800-729-9829. 1-800-729-9829. 1-800-729-9829.
Alex Newman is with us here today on Crosstalk, and so appreciate his joining us from time to time on the broadcast. And as I saw on the calendar, this being UN Day, October 24th, and the official day it came into being October 24th, 1945. I thought Alex was certainly first on my list here to contact. Alex, you have been covering the UN for many, many, many years, researching, writing, attending meetings, exposing what's going on there. And a lot of your writings that you do appear in the New American, and also you post at Liberty Sentinel. So give us a word about these, if you would.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. So, yeah, the New American has been around as long as I have. So I've been sounding the alarm about these very issues since the mid-1980s. It was created as the result of a merger between two other publications. It's affiliated with the John Birch Society, which is a national conservative organization named after a missionary who was murdered by Chinese communists in the aftermath of World War II. He had joined U.S. intelligence. And the goal is very simple: less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. And so the New American is a tool to keep the membership informed and also to do outreach and inform the public, policymakers about these critical issues. A lot of work still to be done, but they've been doing a really good job of getting this information out for well over 35 years. Liberty Sentinel is my company, Liberty Sentinel Media, and we do journalism work for a lot of different clients. We put together radio, TV, print journalism, and you can find us at libertysentinel.org, and we have a free newsletter that people can sign up for right there. So,
okay, libertysentinel.org and also thenewamerican.com. Alex, the UN, has been around for a number of decades, but it just seems in this most recent decade that we have witnessed an organization that seems to be like on steroids. Has it just really exploded as far as its intent and its tentacles? They're wrapping around, many of the institutions?
Yes, it has, and it has been a gradual process over the last 80 years. For a long time, it was almost imperceptible. People were not paying attention to what was going on, and little by little, the UN was accumulating more and more power, a bigger budget, more and more influence over not just the nation states, but businesses and policy making and even religious movements. And it's at the point now where a lot of what happens in your child's classroom is actually being determined at the international level through the UN and in particular UNESCO. And by the way, the guy who runs education for the UN is a member of the Chinese Communist Party, true story. And so this is now something that affects every area of life, right? Agricultural policy now is increasingly under the sway of the UN. It's just every area you look at. And so the way this is moving, I encourage people to think back just a couple of years to the COVID response, where the World Health Organization would tell everybody what needed to happen or what was true, and then every government around the world would fall into line. And it wasn't even just governments, right? Like YouTube, for example. The CEO of YouTube went on CNN and said anything that goes against World Health Organization recommendations is going to be removed from our platform. Right. So suddenly you have an actual leader of an actual Marxist terrorist organization, the guy who runs the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus. He was on the Politburo of the Tigray People's Liberation Front. This guy, all by himself, is now going to determine what Americans can hear and say on the Internet? So now imagine that, not just applied to public health, but apply to every area of your life. And you get a sense of where this will go if we don't stop it.
And matter of fact, Alex, just earlier this month at Liberty Sentinel, you had a posting there on and asking this question: is the United Nations using Google to control dissent and push propaganda?
And of course it is, right? We had an interesting interaction at UN headquarters. The head of the UN Communications Department, her name is Melissa Fleming. Her formal title is Undersecretary General for Communications. And she announced in 2022, ironically at the World Economic Forum, that the UN now had a partnership with Google to control what you could see. And she gave a little bit of context. She said, we first Googled climate change, and we realized that there's all kinds of misinformation about climate change. And she was probably talking about my articles, because for many years, if you Googled climate change, you'd get a lot of my reporting. I've been following the UN climate bandwagon around the world for 15 years. And the Google algorithm used to be based on how many people were reading it, how many people were linking back to it. And so for many years, my stuff, the New American stuff, was right at the top of the search results. And she said, we were very unhappy with that. She said, we own the science, and we think people ought to know that. And Google thought so, too. So we have a partnership with them, and now we're going to be promoting our stuff and suppressing everything else. So I ran into her at the Summit of the Future in New York, and I asked her, I said, Melissa, could you give us, very respectful, people can watch the video. I didn't do anything, untoward. I didn't speak disrespectfully, just journalist question. Melissa, my name is Alex Newman. I'm with the New American Magazine. Could you tell us about this partnership that the UN has with Google? What is the formula you use to determine what people can see and what people shouldn't see? And she got really clammy, and she thought for a minute, and she said, well, I don't recognize you, and I can't talk to you. So she scoots away. And her staff swoop in, and they start, who are you? What do you want? She can't talk to you right now. She doesn't have time. And meanwhile, my cameraman, he's got the camera rolling, and right behind me, as her staffers are pestering me and haranguing me, she's talking to other media outlets. Yeah. So clearly they don't want to talk about this. But trust me, the UN is now manipulating what you can and cannot see when you type something into Google.
We are less than 2 weeks away from our national election, and we know there's much at stake on so many different levels, but let's talk about the level as it relates to the United Nations. I mean, there are really two polar opposites running for office right now as it relates to the UN. Tell us how you see it through your eyes.
Well, we I think start with the very important fact that we never want to put our trust in men. Our trust is not in princes. Our trust is not in men. Our trust is not in politics. Our hope is not in politics. Mm-hmm. Our hope is in the Lord.
Amen. And
only in the Lord. And in fact, the Bible speaks to this very clearly. I gave a talk over the weekend, and I just want to quote this from Psalm 146, verses 3 through 7. It says, "Put not your trust in princes and a son of man in whom there is no salvation. When his breath departs, he returns to the earth. On that very day his plans perish. Blessed is he whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord, his God, who made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, who keeps faith forever." So we need to be clear that politics is not going to be the salvation of America or anything else, right? But with all that out of the way, I think we have a very significant fork in the road here, and the contrast, I think, has never been more clear. On the one hand, we have a candidate who has said that the UN is no friend to America, who has said that the climate thing is a hoax that is being used by the Communist Chinese to dismantle the American economy, a man who, during his first term as president, withdrew from UNESCO, from the World Health Organization, from the UN Relief and Works Agency, from the Paris Agreement, from the UN Compact on Migration, who slapped sanctions on the International Criminal Court. He was a one-man wrecking ball when it came to the architecture and the institutions of globalism. On the other hand, we have a candidate who is currently serving in the administration, and it is the most globalist administration that we have ever had. There's never been a UN agency or program that Joe Biden didn't want to throw your money at. And, of course, Kamala Harris has been by his side this whole time. And, of course, this isn't just about globalism, but the contrast when it comes to the UN and the view of globalism and globalist institutions and national sovereignty could not be more clear. So depending on which way the country goes here, we're either going to supercharge globalism and we're going to surrender the last elements of sovereignty and self-government that we have, and we're going to end up as a province in a one-world totalitarian system, religious, political, and economic, or we're going to send a man to the White House who's going to put his foot down and say, we're done with this stuff. We're not giving you any more money. We're not going to allow you to take any more of our sovereignty. We're not going to be dismantling our economy for the benefit of the communist Chinese. And, by the way, we're not going to allow you to persecute and terrorize Christians. So that's essentially the choice facing us right now. And I would encourage people to be in prayer about this election. It's going to be highly unusual, maybe one of the most important elections in the history of the planet. And so, let's all be in prayer about this, and let's all be as active as we can be.
Friends, you're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America. Alex Newman, our guest. Our phone number here today, 800-733-9829, 1-800-733-9829. We welcome your questions today or brief comments. Alex, you have been advocating a very, very long time to get the UN out of the U.S. and to get the U.S. out of the UN. Practically, how can that be done?
Well, there's actually two bills in Congress right now, one in the House, one in the Senate, that would do precisely that. It would get us out of the United Nations. It's called the Defund Act. There's a House version and a Senate version. The Senate version was introduced by Senator Mike Lee of Utah. The House version was introduced by Congressman Chip Roy of Texas. It's the first time I've ever seen a bill in both houses of Congress to get us out of the UN. So that's major progress. Also, a lot of efforts to defund the UN. That's encouraging as well. We have a majority of the nation's governors now, 26 Republican governors, putting out a statement saying that they were not going to be obeying any UN or World Health Organization ideas or decrees or recommendations on health issues. They said, the federal government doesn't even have any authority over health. How in the world can they delegate a power they don't have to an international organization? It's ridiculous. So we have local governments now across the country saying they're not going to be taking instructions from the UN. We have states passing very serious laws banning UN influence in their states. Louisiana just became the latest one earlier this year to pass some very, very strong language saying that the UN has no authority in this state. We're not going to obey them. We're not going to listen to them, and they should pound sand. That was passed unanimously, by the way, in the Louisiana Senate. Even the Democrats voted for it. So I think public sentiment is shifting on this issue very rapidly. Americans don't want to be taking instructions from the Dictators Club. There's a lot of political action on this, but ultimately we're going to have a lot more public pressure from constituents to be able to have serious action on this. And of course, you and I both know, Jim, that Joe Biden is not going to sign a bill to get us out of the UN.
Right.
But depending on how the election goes, 2025 may have more opportunities for something like that. So.
Friends, our phone number to Crosstalk, 800-733-9829. If the phone's ringing, you just keep it ringing till it's answered. When many lines ring at one time, so just have your patience. As long as you get a ringing sound, you're going to get through to us. 800-733-9829. Let's begin with Blanche in Ohio. Blanche, you're on the air.
Yes, I'm so glad that you were on here today, because last week I heard him on there saying put a poster out, UN exit. And I made a poster and put out in my yard or out by the road, UN exit. And I'm so glad I got a hold of you there, because this is the most horrible thing that, going on with this, what they're doing. And I don't want the UN taking over our country and taking our ability to do anything away. And I can't stand it.
Yep, thank you.
And I'm so glad that you were on there today to talk about this.
Thank you, Blanche. Thank you for the call.
Okay. God bless America, and God bless you all.
Amen. Thank you. And Alex, Blanche is she's helping to get the word out. She's putting a sign up at her window about getting the UN out of here, UN exit. It really takes involvement. I mean, we can shake our heads and say, oh, it's no good for us. But, when's the last time we contacted our senator or congressman in regard to this to put heat on them who are going to ultimately be making that decision, voting on legislation like this?
Yeah, that's a very good point, Jim. If our elected representatives are going to represent us, they need to know what we want. And you'll find very few people who want to keep throwing money at an organization like the UN that spends half of its time hating on Israel and the other half trying to usurp our sovereignty and take away our freedoms. So, you really won't find a lot of people who support that. But when your congressman is only hearing from special interest groups that want to throw more money at the UN, what are they going to do? So we've got to be on the phone with them. We've got to go to meetings with them and let them know.
We'll be back in 1 minute, friends, and this is why it's critical you participate in casting your vote here this election. Early voting underway. Election day coming up soon. Back in a minute on Crosstalk.
For the Worldview Report, I'm Brandon House. Some theologians have used 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 through 12, which speaks about those during the tribulation who perish because they refuse to love the truth, that they might be saved. And it says, and for this reason, God will send them a strong delusion that they should believe the lie, and that they may be condemned who do not believe the truth, but have pleasure in unrighteousness. Some theologians have used this verse to say that anyone who rejects Christ before the rapture cannot become a Christian during the tribulation period. This is not true. This is not even what 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is talking about. It's talking about people during the tribulation who, well, take the mark of the beast, as Revelation 14 describes, who are condemned. In fact, we have 144,000 Jews who become great evangelists. One would have to assume to some degree they have rejected Messiah, right? But in the tribulation, they become believers and great evangelists. Keep preaching to your unsaved relatives and friends.
Alex Newman is with us here today on Crosstalk, and check out a site, libertysentinel.org, libertysentinel.org, and he also writes columns for The New American, thenewamerican.com. You'll find much information there. Matter of fact, you go in the search engine, you type in United Nations. Friends, you've got a lot of reading ahead of you. Let's go to David in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. David, you're on the air.
Yeah, just wondering what your view is. Would it be strategically more effective for us to remain in the populace in a diverse way, or would it be more effective for us to consolidate as a group in various regions to oppose this?
Well, certainly you're going to have votes coming from your congressmen and senators. If everybody's in the same area contacting the same senators or congressmen, Alex, I would think a very diverse vote from all over the nation would be important.
Yeah, and there's been a debate about this for a very long time. Should liberty-minded Christians try to consolidate in a few states? Frankly, I don't think we need to. I certainly see the wisdom and the desirability of that. I mean, who among us hasn't thought about moving to northern Idaho or Montana or Wyoming, being among like-minded people with a like-minded government? But really, we need God's people. We need people who value liberty and truth to be all across the country. So I think ultimately it's really just, what does your conscience say? If God is urging you to go to a particular place, follow that. But if you have good reason to stay where you are, do that. And I think ultimately we trust in God to handle these things. But no matter where we are, one thing we must be firm on is we have to be active. We've got to be doing things for the Lord, and that includes all area of our lives, including, I think, very much politics, business, etc.
Thank you, David.
Amen.
Thank you for the call. Tony in Neillsville, Wisconsin, you're on the air.
I have a brief comment, Jim, and thank you very much. That President, this is the most important election of our lifetime, and President Trump needs to win every state in the country, even Minnesota. And President Reagan didn't even do that back in '84. Mm-hmm. And I remember in 1976, when it was America's 200th birthday, how patriotic we were and so proud to be Americans. And we have went so far down the toilet to that day. It is pathetic.
Yeah, Tony, thanks for the call. Alex, it's as if people are being shamed today, if they honor the flag and what the flag represents.
Yes, and that's all by design. I mean, there's a deliberate agenda here to turn Americans against their family. There's a deliberate agenda to turn Americans against their country. And perhaps most importantly of all, there's a deliberate agenda to turn people against God himself.
Yes.
So it's a very, very dangerous agenda. And, the attack on patriotism is not unique to the United States, but we see it especially pronounced in the United States because of the principles that it's based on and across broader Christendom, right? They're telling all the people of the historically Christian nations, the Anglosphere, Western Europe, they're telling them that your country's bad, you should be ashamed of yourself, you've exported nothing but misery to the world. And really the exact opposite is true. The United States has taken the gospel to every corner of the world. And we don't want to be proud, but that is something that we really should smile about, that God has used this nation in that way, that he has used this nation to bring freedom to so many. And so, it's a horrible thing to teach children to be ashamed of a country that has done so much, that has been used so mightily by God.
Faith is calling from central Pennsylvania. Faith, you're on the air.
Yes, it must have been in the 1980s that my dad got me to listen to Vic and Ingrid, and thanks to Mr. Dick Dean and his station. Well, my dad had started to say, get the U.S. out of the UN. So I'm thankful for the heritage that I found in all of you.
Thank you so very much. Yeah, it certainly has been a topic that we have hit for decades here on the Crosstalk program. Dick is calling from Mountain, Wisconsin. You're on the air, Dick.
Yeah, it certainly has been
Hello, Dick.
a topic that we have hit.
Dick.
Good afternoon.
Yes, go ahead. You're on the air.
Well, thank you very much for your programming today and every day. You get good guests and good topics. My comment was that I'm 73 years old. I'll be 74 in January, pastor in Northeast Wisconsin. I'll tell you what, when I look at the United Nations, what it stood for years ago, we used to go out and trick-or-treat for UNICEF. I was probably a pretty naive young kid at the time.
Yeah.
But as I look at what the United Nations has become, I think you're right on the money. We cannot be subservient to a world organization where we have signed off on our own integrity and our own allegiance to our country. So I support those kinds of efforts, and I'm hoping that after this election that there's others that kind of reveal those things so that we can decide how we can best extract ourselves from the UN and make a statement across the globe.
Great. Pastor, thank you for your call. I appreciate that. Alex, I remember those days, too. Elementary school, we were getting little cardboard boxes, and we were to go trick-or-treat for UNICEF and to collect those pennies and nickels and dimes to try and help the children of the world.
Yeah, and it's a shame that the UN has been able to deceive so many otherwise well-meaning people into believing that it's a decent organization. UNICEF is, of course, one of the many culprits within the UN system. And they still have, if you go around the world, you still find a lot of people who regard the UN as kind of like the last best hope for mankind. And so, of course, that takes their eyes off of Christ, where their eyes should be. And it also leads them to innocently and naively support an organization that is doing so much harm, perpetrating so much evil against our fellow human beings.
Gary in Mesa, Arizona, you're on the air.
Yeah, hey, thank you very much. Hey, Alex, I'm familiar with your work. Some people in the Mesa area, where I'm an active Republican, have mentioned your name many times. I want to know if you believe that, as I do, that the United Nations building is the Tower of Babel in these modern days, and voters tear down that walls.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Alex, down to 30 seconds. Your comment.
Well, thank you. I do believe we're seeing a repeat of Genesis chapter 11 with all the nations and peoples of the world trying to come together to defy God. Psalm 2 talks about this, the kings and the princes of the world conspiring against the Lord, but ultimately their evil plans will fail. And I hope someday we can turn the UN building into something useful, maybe demolish it and use the space for a park. But in the meantime, we trust in the Lord, and His plan will be perfect.
Yeah, that's the green space that we really need in New York, isn't it? LibertySentinel.org, the website, thenewamerican.com. Alex Newman, our guest here today, talking about the United Nations. It's anniversary day today, but looking at its past, its present, certainly its lust for future control as well. Alex, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. God bless you.
And friends, thank you so much for tuning into Crosstalk. Share this information with others. The information you have learned, share the link through your social media channels. God bless you. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208, or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.